Tonight, we drift into the quiet corners of country Victoria, to a town where nothing much ever happens, until, quite suddenly, something does. This is a story that begins with a lunch, not a crime scene, not a late-night chase, just a Sunday meal shared between family. No one expected what followed. 3 people would die, 1 would survive, barely, and at the center of it all, a woman, a plate of food, and a silence that still hasn't lifted. This is not a tale of monsters lurking in the shadows. There are no flashing knives or roaring sirens. Only soft questions, strange details, and a case that continues to unfold, step by slow step. Tonight, we gently unspool the story of Erin Patterson, the woman some call the mushroom killer. As always, we'll tread lightly. This is a space for calm curiosity, not horror. A place where true crime is told not to jolt you, but to settle beside you like a low hum in the dark. So settle in. Let the blankets gather. Let the day roll away behind you. And together, we'll walk carefully into a mystery. One that begins not with a scream, but with a meal. You're listening to the Dozing Detective. Let's begin. In the gentle hills of Victoria's South Gippsland, nestled among lush greenery and winding country roads, lies the town of Leongatha. It's not a place that typically stirs the national imagination. Life here drifts by at the pace of soft breezes through eucalypt trees. Local cafes hum with quiet conversation. Neighbors nod to one another at the post office. It's the kind of place where change comes slowly and trouble rarely lingers. But in the winter of 2023, a quiet horror crept into Leongatha. One that didn't shout, didn't rage. It whispered. A story of death not by violence, but by a meal. A lunch shared among family that ended in funerals, questions, and the shadow of suspicion that still has not lifted. This is not a tale of monsters lurking in the dark. It's not a story of serial killers or hardened criminals. This one is subtler, stranger, a tragedy steeped in ambiguity, where the line between misfortune and malice blurs like fog rolling across a country road. At the heart of this unfolding mystery is a woman named Erin Patterson, a mother, a cook, a figure known to her neighbors, once perhaps unremarkably so, until a homemade meal allegedly served with beef, Wellington and mushrooms left 3 people dead and another gravely ill. The whispers began almost immediately. Who would serve death at a dinner table? Was it deliberate? Was it carelessness? Or something else entirely? The deaths that followed that July afternoon sent ripples far beyond the quiet streets of South Gippsland. The national media descended. The public speculated. Mycologists were consulted. Investigators combed through evidence that included a dehydrator found discarded at the local tip. But as we begin this story, let's not leap to conclusions. This case is not yet closed. No verdict has been rendered. No confession confirmed. In the soft stillness of an unsolved mystery, we begin not with an accusation, but with a question. What really happened that day in Leongatha? Tonight, let us gently unravel the details, not to judge, but to understand. Let us walk slowly through the events, the relationships, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround the so-called mushroom killer. This is a story of food and family, of grief and suspicion, of a country town caught in a spotlight it never asked for. So settle in, let your breathing slow. The tale we tell will unfold with quiet care, no jolts, no terror. Just the soft turning of pages in a story still waiting for its final chapter. Because not all true crime is loud. Some arrives like a whisper over the dinner table. The meal that would become known across Australia, whispered about in headlines, repeated in podcasts, examined in courtrooms, began, as so many family gatherings do, with an invitation, a gesture, simple and familiar, an offer of lunch. It was the end of July 2023. Winter still pressed gently against the edges of the town, though the days had begun to stretch a little longer. Erin Patterson extended the invitation to her former in-laws, Gail and Don Patterson, both in their 70s. Joining them would be Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and Heather's husband, Ian, the local Baptist pastor. The lunch was to be held at Erin's home on the outskirts of Leongatha, where she lived with her 2 school-aged children. There was history here, not just between Erin and her guests, but years of tangled family connection, cordial in parts, strained in others. Erin had once been married to Simon Patterson, the son of Don and Gail. Though the marriage had ended, ties had not entirely severed. Family, especially in a close-knit place like Leongatha, rarely untangles so cleanly. The invitation, some would later say, seemed like a peace offering. Others suggested it was part of an ongoing effort to remain civil for the sake of the children. Erin, a former teacher and freelance writer, had previously been active in the community. Though quiet and reserved by some accounts, she wasn't without warmth. The guests arrived at the house with little fanfare. There was no sign, no hint, that this meal would be any different from the dozens, perhaps hundreds, of meals they had shared over the years as a family. No one noted anything unusual as they sat down at Erin's kitchen table, plates set before them, the afternoon sunlight falling lazily across the floorboards. On the menu was a homemade beef Wellington, a dish known for its rich, comforting layers, beef tenderloin wrapped in mushroom duxelles and puff pastry. There were side dishes too, including a salad and perhaps a dessert. The meal was, by all accounts, satisfying. No one complained. No one paused to ask where the ingredients had come from. At some point, Erin's children, reportedly picky eaters, were served a different dish. They did not eat the beef Wellington. That fact, while seemingly minor, would later become a fulcrum for suspicion and speculation. Why had the children been served something else? Was it out of parental instinct, knowing their preferences, or something more deliberate? Hours after the guest departed, a quiet dread began to take root. First came the discomfort, a vague unease in the stomach, then waves of nausea, stomach cramps, sweating, the kind of symptoms that might be mistaken for a stomach bug or mild food poisoning at first, unpleasant, but not necessarily alarming. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that this was something more, something worse. All 4 of the lunch guests began exhibiting signs of acute distress. Within 24 hours, their conditions worsened to the point of hospitalization. At first, it wasn't immediately understood what had caused the rapid decline, but the symptoms were consistent with something far more dangerous than a simple case of bad takeaway or undercooked meat. They pointed, horrifyingly, to the possibility of toxic mushroom ingestion. Back in Erin's home, the atmosphere must have shifted, a quiet horror settling in, the kind that doesn't shout, but seeps into the corners of a room like a cold draft. One can only imagine the creeping realization that something had gone terribly wrong. Later, it would be said that Erin herself did not fall ill, a detail as innocuous as it is damning. She claimed to have eaten the same meal, just not the same portion. She, too, would be hospitalized later with gastrointestinal symptoms, though they were comparatively mild and did not require liver support. But at this stage in the story, all anyone knew was that 4 people had shared a meal, and all 4 were now fighting for their lives. In a town like Leongatha, word travels fast. But this wasn't the usual small-town gossip. This was something more chilling, something no one knew quite how to talk about, something that would soon become national news. For now, though, the focus remained on the sick, and the quiet, terrible mystery growing behind the doors of that suburban kitchen. The beef Wellington was plated with care, a dish that evokes comfort, occasion, and effort. Puff pastry golden and flaked at the edges, concealing its savoury heart. The mushrooms, finely chopped, browned, and blended into the duxelles, played a key role in the flavour. But in this case, they would become something far more ominous. While forensic science would later attempt to unravel exactly what kind of mushrooms had been used, the suspicion almost immediately turned toward the Amanita phalloides, commonly known as the death cap mushroom. To the untrained eye, these mushrooms can resemble edible varieties, found in parts of Victoria, often at the base of oak trees. They are deceptively ordinary looking, yet they contain toxins so potent that even a small amount can be lethal. Death cap mushrooms are not native to Australia. They were introduced, likely unintentionally, and have since taken hold in certain regions. Their presence is sparse but deadly, responsible for the vast majority of mushroom-related deaths worldwide. Their poison is insidious, symptoms often delayed, lulling victims into a false sense of recovery before liver failure begins. In the days following the luncheon, it was reported that mushrooms had been foraged, though not by Erin herself, according to her later statement. She claimed to have purchased dried mushrooms from an Asian grocery store months prior. These, she said, had been in her pantry, rehydrated for the dish. The truth of that statement has yet to be fully tested in court, but the possibility of mistaken identity using a deadly mushroom in the belief that it was safe remains a critical element in the case. Back in the kitchen, the meal had been prepared without obvious alarm. There were no frantic calls to poison control, no immediate reactions during or after the meal. Everything appeared to have gone as planned. What makes the scenario so chilling is precisely that. It's normalcy. One of the central tensions in the case lies in the banality of the moment. There were no overt threats, no obvious signs of malice, just a home-cooked meal, shared among family. Yet the aftermath was devastating. Within 24 hours, the 4 guests were in hospital. All of them were suffering from symptoms consistent with severe mushroom poisoning: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. As time passed, their conditions did not improve. Blood work revealed signs of liver damage. 2 of them, Don and Gail Patterson, were airlifted to Austin Hospital in Melbourne, home to one of the state's leading liver transplant units. Heather and Ian Wilkinson followed shortly after. The doctors, skilled though they were, had seen this pattern before. Death cap poisoning presents with a signature arc: delayed symptoms followed by sudden deterioration. Once liver damage begins, the chances of survival diminish rapidly without intensive care, often without a transplant. As the family deteriorated in hospital beds miles away from that quiet Leongatha kitchen, investigators began retracing their steps. Attention turned to the food. What had been served? Where had it come from? What else had been in the meal? The beef was standard. The pastry, store-bought. The salad, innocuous. But the mushrooms were the variable. Reports began circulating about a food dehydrator, allegedly used in preparing the meal, that had been discarded at the local rubbish tip not long after the lunch. Authorities recovered it. Forensic analysis began. The discovery of the dehydrator and its disposal raised eyebrows. Why throw it away? Erin would later say she was panicking, that she had disposed of it out of fear that her children or others might be harmed by its contents. She maintained that there had been no deliberate attempt to hurt anyone, that she too had eaten the meal. Yet she had not fallen ill in the same way, nor had her children, who, as we know, ate something different that day. For the grieving families, the horror was compounded by uncertainty. They had no answers, only questions. Back at the hospital, the news was grim. Within days, 3 of the 4 guests had died: Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson. Only one survived, Pastor Ian Wilkinson, after weeks in hospital and an eventual liver transplant that saved his life. The term mushroom killer began to circulate in the press, not as a verdict, but as a phrase, ambiguous, haunting, and impossible to ignore. But long before the term made headlines, the seeds of suspicion had already been planted. Not through some dramatic reveal, not through an outburst or confession, just through the quiet, persistent facts: who had cooked the meal, who had eaten what, and who had lived. The shadows began to gather, and Erin Patterson stood at the center of them, not yet accused, not yet charged, but no longer invisible. The symptoms did not arrive with drama or noise. They crept in slowly, like a low mist over paddocks at dusk. At first, nothing seemed out of place, just a mild discomfort. Perhaps the kind of indigestion one might expect after a rich lunch. But by evening, the unease had begun to sharpen, and by nightfall, it became impossible to ignore. Each of the 4 guests who attended the meal began experiencing severe gastrointestinal symptoms: nausea, vomiting, watery diarrhea, the kind of signs easily mistaken for a stomach virus or foodborne illness, unpleasant but not uncommon. Yet there was something more stubborn in these symptoms, something that didn't ease with time. Don and Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband Ian all began to deteriorate in parallel. The hours following their return home became a blur of illness and confusion. Emergency services were contacted. The 4 were admitted to regional hospitals, where the true nature of their conditions began to unfold. Doctors, initially baffled, began to suspect something far more sinister than a common infection. The patients were all presenting with signs of severe liver stress, a red flag that pointed toward a rare but deadly cause. And then the clue emerged: mushrooms, a shared meal that included wild mushrooms. The phrase alone sent shivers through the medical staff. The likely culprit, Amanita phalloides, the death cap, is infamous among toxicologists. Its poison, amatoxin, is stealthy. It resists cooking. It has no distinctive taste or odor, but its effects are devastating. After initial symptoms, patients often experience a deceptive improvement, a so-called false recovery phase, before the real damage begins: the liver, and sometimes kidneys, shutting down entirely. Within days, Don, Gail, and Heather had all succumbed to liver failure. The shock of their passing hit like a quiet wave through the community. No screaming headlines in those first moments, just whispers of disbelief. These were well-known, well-loved members of Leongatha's tight-knit world. Gail and Don were considered pillars of their church. Heather and Ian, equally active in their community, were known for their warmth and faith. Pastor Ian Wilkinson, remarkably, held on. He was transferred to Austin Hospital in Melbourne, where specialists worked to stabilize him. A liver transplant was performed, a critical intervention that ultimately saved his life. But it was a long and grueling recovery, one that kept him in intensive care for weeks. As the public began to learn of the incident, the atmosphere shifted. Mourning turned to confusion. How could such a thing happen at a family lunch? How could mushrooms, something so seemingly benign, result in such devastating consequences? And one question lingered in nearly every conversation. Why had Erin Patterson survived? Erin had also reportedly fallen ill, or at least claimed to. She had presented to a hospital with gastrointestinal distress, but was discharged shortly after. Her symptoms did not progress to liver damage. Some would later suggest this was evidence of her innocence, others that it was too convenient to ignore. What was certain was this: 3 people were dead. 1 man was fighting for his life, and the meal that had brought them all together was now being investigated as a potential crime scene. In the days that followed, detectives visited Erin's home. Evidence was collected. A search was conducted. The discarded food dehydrator was found at the local tip and retrieved. Every detail, every decision made in those days after the meal was suddenly viewed through a new lens. The quiet home where a family had once gathered was now a place of suspicion, examined by forensics, photographed by media, whispered about by neighbors. Erin, once an ordinary figure in town, became the focus of a national conversation. And through it all, Leongatha held its breath. Leongatha had always been a town where things made sense. The rhythms of daily life followed a familiar pattern. Work, school, weekend markets, family barbecues. News spread quickly, but usually the kind that could be shared over a cup of tea or murmured across a shop counter. A birthday, a sale, a neighbor selling their home. But this was something else. In the weeks that followed the deaths of Don, Gail, and Heather, an eerie hush fell over the town. Conversations became cautious. Smiles faded into polite nods. The usual country town confidence, that sense of knowing what's going on in your own backyard, had vanished. In its place, uncertainty, and a quiet, gnawing unease. The story had grown too large for the town to hold on to alone. The media had arrived in full force. Camera crews lined the street where Erin Patterson lived. Reporters loitered at the hospital where Pastor Ian remained in critical care. Headlines screamed what the town could only whisper: "Mushroom lunch turns deadly." Did she mean to kill? The mystery of Leongatha's deadly meal. Locals recoiled from the sudden attention. Some closed ranks, refusing to speak to the press. Others watched warily, giving cautious interviews to express sympathy, but withholding judgment. Because in a town this size, everyone knew someone connected to the story. To choose a side, too soon, too loudly, was to risk tearing apart friendships built over decades. Erin Patterson had not been charged, not yet. She had not confessed, and in the absence of formal accusations, all that remained was suspicion. But suspicion, once sown, spreads like smoke. People remembered things differently now. The way she seemed reserved at school events, the time she looked distracted at the cafe, her decision to homeschool the children, her tendency to keep to herself. These details, once benign, were now examined under the harsh light of hindsight. Erin herself remained largely silent. She kept to her home, protected from reporters by drawn blinds and firm statements from her legal team. When she did speak, a written statement eventually released to police and the public. It offered explanations but no closure. She denied wrongdoing. She said the mushrooms were purchased, not foraged. She had no idea, she said, that they were dangerous. She loved her in-laws, she claimed. She would never hurt them. But still, the questions lingered. Why had only the guests fallen ill? Why discard the dehydrator? Why did Erin's children eat a different meal? And underneath it all, was it truly a tragic accident or something more deliberate? For Leongatha, the case became a sort of mirror, reflecting back its own fears and assumptions. It reminded people of how close we live to danger, even when it wears a familiar face, that the line between family and harm can sometimes blur, that tragedy doesn't always come with warning signs or dramatic music. Sometimes it walks through the front door with a homemade pie. Church services turned somber. Local pastors spoke of grief, healing, and justice, careful not to name names. Community vigils were held, and still, behind every candlelight and hymn, was the unspoken truth. The town had changed, perhaps forever. To most people in Leongatha, Erin Patterson was not a name that stood out, at least not before the luncheon. She wasn't a figure of drama or controversy. She hadn't caused a stir at school pickups or drawn attention at local events. If she was known at all, it was in passing, as someone's former daughter-in-law, as a mum, as a quiet woman who mostly kept to herself. But as the investigation deepened and headlines multiplied, the public's curiosity shifted. The question now on everyone's mind was simple, chilling, and nearly impossible to answer. Who is Erin Patterson? Really? Born in the late 1970s, Erin grew up in country Victoria, raised in what has been described as a conventional, middle-class family. She studied teaching, worked in schools, and spent time as a freelance writer. Her early life offered no indication of future infamy. No brushes with the law, no history of violence, no disturbing social media posts. She seemed, by all accounts, unremarkable. Erin married Simon Patterson, son of Don and Gail, in the early 2000s. The couple had 2 children and settled into suburban life in the South Gippsland region. But like many marriages, theirs became strained. The pair eventually separated, though the exact timing and nature of the split remain somewhat unclear. What is known is that, despite the separation, Erin and Simon appeared to maintain a civil relationship for the sake of their children. Co-parenting arrangements were reportedly in place. Simon, who worked in IT and was well regarded in his professional circles, remained connected to his parents and the local church. Erin, meanwhile, largely withdrew from public life. In the aftermath of the deadly lunch, details began to emerge about Erin's personal struggles, though these too were presented in fragments, lacking clarity or confirmation. There were mentions of mental health difficulties, family tensions, conflicting reports about past arguments and grievances. Erin herself claimed she had been trying to reconcile with her in-laws, that the lunch was meant as a gesture of goodwill. But for investigators, such gestures are not taken at face value. Every relationship, every past disagreement, becomes a piece of the puzzle. The fact that all 4 guests were members of Erin's former extended family, and that Erin was the one who had cooked for them, placed her squarely at the center of suspicion. It didn't help that her children had not eaten the same meal, nor that she had discarded a food dehydrator in the days after the incident. Public reaction to Erin was deeply divided. Some saw her as a potential villain, a woman driven by resentment or quiet rage, capable of something unthinkable. Others viewed her as a scapegoat, a woman overwhelmed, perhaps careless, but not malicious. Her own statements fueled both narratives. In August 2023, Erin handed a written statement to police, which was later obtained by the media. In it, she claimed the mushrooms were dried fungi purchased from an Asian grocery store in Melbourne months earlier. She said she had rehydrated them for the beef Wellington, unaware they might be toxic. She expressed devastation over the deaths and insisted she had no reason to hurt those she had once called family. She also revealed for the first time that Simon, her ex-husband, had been invited to the lunch but pulled out at the last minute, a detail that sent shivers down the spine of many readers. Had he been there, would he have died as well? Simon himself had remained largely silent, but it emerged that he too had been hospitalized in the previous year with unexplained stomach issues. The connection, if any, between that illness and the luncheon remained unclear, but the timing raised eyebrows. Erin's legal representation urged the public to reserve judgment. She had not been charged with a crime. She had cooperated with police. She was grieving too, they said. But as media interest intensified, Erin's life became a portrait painted by inference. Old photos were dug up. Online profiles were dissected. Every action, every expression became a clue in the court of public opinion. And yet, for all the attention, Erin Patterson remained something of an enigma. Not gregarious, not vengeful, not easily categorized. Just a woman in a small house behind drawn curtains, waiting. Waiting as 3 members of her former family were buried. Waiting as police continued to investigate. Waiting as the nation watched. In the days following the deaths of Don, Gail, and Heather, investigators faced a delicate and daunting task, piecing together what had truly happened at the now infamous luncheon. The scene was not a dark alley or a blood-stained room. It was a tidy kitchen in a country town, a Sunday lunch shared among family. No screaming, no struggle, just symptoms and silence. Yet beneath that calm veneer, something deadly had passed through. Victoria Police launched a homicide investigation, not because there had been an official declaration of intent, but because the circumstances demanded scrutiny. 3 people were dead. 1 was fighting for his life, and the woman who had prepared the meal, Erin Patterson, was the common link. Initial statements were taken. Witnesses were contacted. Toxicology results began to return from the hospital labs, and all signs pointed to one chilling conclusion. Death cap mushrooms had almost certainly been consumed. The Amanita phalloides species, though not native to Australia, had established itself in parts of Victoria, particularly in the cool, damp environments where imported European trees had been planted. Experts from the Department of Health were brought in. Mycologists, forensic pathologists, and toxicologists began collaborating with police. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was how the mushrooms had entered the meal. Erin maintained they were purchased, dried and packaged from an Asian grocery store months earlier, but police had difficulty confirming this claim. No receipt had been produced, no clear packaging remained. And then there was the dehydrator. Reports emerged that Erin had disposed of a food dehydrator shortly after the lunch, a seemingly mundane appliance, but one that, in context, raised eyebrows. Why discard it? Why now? Investigators tracked it to a local tip and retrieved it for forensic testing. Was it used to dry the mushrooms? Could traces of amatoxin, the poison found in death caps, be detected? These were questions that could only be answered through painstaking analysis. But the act of discarding the device itself was, at minimum, suspicious. Meanwhile, Erin gave a written statement to police. She expressed sorrow for the deaths, maintained her innocence, and explained that she, too, had eaten the meal. She reported feeling ill afterward and said she went to the hospital as a precaution. But her symptoms were far milder than those of her guests. She did not require hospitalization beyond basic monitoring. Her liver showed no signs of significant stress. The difference in severity puzzled investigators. If she had consumed the same food, why was she largely unharmed? Some theorized portion size might be to blame. That Erin had eaten less of the mushroom mixture. Others considered whether she had somehow known the food was dangerous and had limited her intake. But these remain theories. No direct evidence yet pointed to intent. Detectives conducted multiple searches of Erin's home, seizing a number of items including cooking utensils, food packaging, and electronic devices. It was reported that police were also looking into internet search histories, purchase records, and communication logs. If there had been planning, a recipe downloaded, a web search for poisonous mushrooms, it could suggest premeditation. But again, this was all part of a patient, quiet investigation. The police, for their part, said little publicly. They described Erin as a person of interest, not a suspect, not yet accused. No arrests had been made. And without a confession or smoking gun, they tread carefully. The media, however, filled the silence. Articles speculated about motives. Some suggested long-standing resentment toward the Pattersons. Others pointed to Simon's absence, that he had been invited but cancelled, as a possible clue to intent. Erin's past, her marriage, her mental health, all became fodder for public consumption. But the police were focused on evidence. Step by step, they worked their way through forensics, toxicology, interviews, and timeline reconstruction. They wanted facts, not fiction. And still, through all of this, Erin Patterson remained free. Under scrutiny, yes, questioned, watched, but not charged, not yet. As the investigation unfolded behind closed doors, Erin Patterson maintained a careful, often deafening silence. No television interviews, no public tears, no dramatic proclamations of innocence or guilt. Just a few carefully chosen words, released through statements, and the persistent presence of her quiet suburban house behind drawn blinds. And in that silence, the world filled the gaps. Questions, speculation, judgment, all began to swirl, carried by headlines and hashtags, radio call-ins and podcast debates. In the absence of clarity, the public leaned in closer, drawn by the uniquely domestic horror of the case. A home-cooked meal, a family gathering, 3 dead, 1 in a coma, and a hostess whose story did not quite satisfy. Her written statement to police, obtained and later leaked to media outlets, only added to the mystery. In it, Erin reiterated her innocence. She said the mushrooms had been rehydrated from a packet purchased months ago at a Melbourne-based Asian grocery. She expressed remorse over the tragedy and said she had tried to be a good daughter-in-law, despite her separation from Simon. I am now devastated to think that these mushrooms may have contributed to the illness suffered by my loved ones, she wrote. I really want to repeat that I had absolutely no reason to hurt these people whom I loved. She also revealed that she, too, had been hospitalized, but recovered quickly, and that her children, though present in the home, had eaten a separate meal, tailored to their usual picky tastes. But these details, offered as explanation, raised new questions. If Erin had purchased the mushrooms in question, why couldn't she produce the packaging? Could the store be identified? Had she told anyone about using the mushrooms before the meal? Why serve the beef Wellington to some, but not to all? And most haunting of all, why had Simon, her ex-husband, not been there? According to her statement, Erin had invited Simon to the lunch. He declined, citing other commitments. Some speculated that he may have received a warning, though no evidence ever supported that theory. Still, in a story so clouded with uncertainty, even coincidence took on sinister weight. Simon, for his part, remained entirely silent, grieving his parents, supporting his children, keeping out of the spotlight. But a report surfaced that he had previously suffered from a mysterious illness in 2022, one that also involved gastrointestinal symptoms and hospital admission. Once again, there were no confirmed links between that event and the July luncheon, but it deepened the unease, the sense that something beneath the surface was not as benign as it seemed. Meanwhile, Erin stayed in Leongatha. She did not flee, did not relocate, but she also did not engage. Friends reportedly stopped visiting. The front yard grew quiet. Curtains were drawn tighter. Her presence in the town became spectral. Seen only in glances through car windows, whispered about in supermarket aisles, never directly confronted. The press lingered. The public speculated. Was this an elaborate accident? A tragic mistake of misidentification? Thinking a poisonous mushroom was safe? Or was this a case of domestic vendetta served on a plate? The police continued their investigation, but months passed without charges. The absence of decisive action from authorities became its own form of pressure, fueling frustration, suspicion, even conspiracy theories. Forensic toxicology is not quick work. Detecting amatoxins in tissue samples, testing cookware, verifying digital footprints, it all takes time. And with a case this unusual, investigators were likely proceeding with extreme caution. Any misstep could jeopardize a potential prosecution, or worse, falsely implicate someone innocent. So the case lived in a state of suspension. Erin Patterson, not convicted, not cleared, not behind bars, but not free of judgment either. Public opinion is rarely patient, and in Erin's silence, many made up their minds. Even so, in the quiet of Leongatha, some voices urged restraint, that perhaps what had unfolded truly was an accident, that mushroom poisonings, though rare, were not unprecedented in Australia, that grief, however complicated, did not equate to guilt, but others could not let go of the facts, the selective symptoms, the timing, the disposal of key evidence, the survival of the hostess and her children, the statement that answered little but stirred much. The case, still unsolved, lingered in that liminal space between tragedy and crime. And Erin, calm, still, nearly voiceless, stood at the center of the storm. For weeks, then months, the investigation moved quietly. A presence more than a performance. Detectives gathered evidence, consulted with toxicologists, and built their case out of the silence Erin Patterson left behind. Every thread was pulled with caution, because a case like this, so unprecedented, so strange, could not afford haste. Then, in early November 2023, came the shift. Just after sunrise on November 2nd, detectives arrived at Erin's modest home with a warrant. The street remained calm. There were no flashing lights, no yelling, But by midday, the news was everywhere. Erin Patterson had been arrested. The charge was as chilling as it was inevitable. 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder, relating not only to the July luncheon, but also to prior incidents involving her former husband, Simon Patterson. Though details of those earlier allegations remained sealed at first, the charges pointed to a broader pattern investigators now believed they could prove. The country, indeed much of the world, turned its eyes once again to Leongatha. But this time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was the realization that the story had taken a decisive legal turn. Erin was taken into custody and transferred to the Wontagi police station, where she was interviewed. Detectives outlined the charges. Erin, according to early reports, remained composed, offering no formal statement beyond what had already been documented months earlier. Later that same day, she appeared briefly in court. Her appearance was quiet, no grandstanding, no dramatic denial, just a woman in a pale blue jumper, flanked by legal counsel, listening as the charges were read aloud. She did not apply for bail. The judge remanded her in custody, and Erin was taken to a women's prison facility where she awaited further court proceedings. The timeline of the case was laid out, an evidentiary brief to be compiled over months, with the next court hearing scheduled for well into the following year. Meanwhile, the broader public reaction was complex. For some, the arrest brought relief. Not closure, but movement. A validation of what many had suspected for months. For others, it raised discomfort, because now the questions became sharper. If Erin truly was guilty, then what had happened wasn't an accident. It was something much darker, a deliberate poisoning planned and executed within the quiet rituals of a family meal. But Erin, through her legal team, continued to maintain her innocence. There had been no confession, no trial. And in Australia's justice system, guilt is not declared by public opinion, but proven beyond reasonable doubt in court. The police, for their part, offered a brief press conference following the arrest. They spoke of the painstaking nature of the investigation, how mushroom poisonings presented unique forensic challenges. They thanked toxicologists, medical professionals, and the public for their patience. They gave no dramatic speeches, no speculation, just the facts. The list of charges was significant. 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Don and Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson. 2 additional counts of attempted murder for the severe illness suffered by Ian Wilkinson and reportedly Simon Patterson. And 3 more counts, also of attempted murder, linked to what investigators described as historical incidents, suggesting prior suspected attempts that had not previously been made public. What those incidents involved and how they were discovered remains to be fully revealed. Erin's legal team requested privacy and restraint. The case was sub judice, they reminded the public, under judicial consideration. A trial would come, but not soon. The evidence needed to be presented in court, not dissected in tabloids. And so, the case returned once again to a holding pattern. Erin Patterson, now behind bars. The town of Leongatha, still reeling. A family shattered, survivors grieving, and a nation watching. But with the arrest came something that hadn't existed before. A direction. The justice system had taken the reins. The whispers had become testimony. The suspicions had become formal charges. And slowly, the story that began with a quiet meal in a country kitchen began its transformation. From tragedy to investigation to prosecution. Even with Erin Patterson behind bars, even with murder charges formally laid, a peculiar fog remains over the case. Because despite everything that's been said, reported, and suspected, the truth is, no one outside the investigators and courts knows exactly what happened that day. And maybe no one ever will. The legal process will unfold as it should, slowly, methodically, under the careful rhythm of justice. But for now, the unanswered questions loom large, stretching across news segments, podcast episodes, and late-night conversations. Not because people are eager for gore or scandal, but because the case is so quietly strange. This wasn't a crime of passion, witnessed in the heat of the moment. It wasn't a spree or a robbery, or an act of revenge caught on camera. It was a meal, a dish, a plate of food. What complicates the narrative is how little evidence, at least publicly, draws a straight line. There was no poison bottle found in a cupboard, no typed-out manifesto, no confession, no witness, no footage, just symptoms, a discarded dehydrator, and a woman whose story has never fully added up. The court may one day determine guilt or innocence, but the human part of the story, the mystery, the feeling, is harder to put to rest. Could it really have been an accident, a misidentified mushroom, one innocent error leading to irreversible consequences? It's possible. Death-cap mushrooms are deceptive, and poisonings, though rare, do happen. There have been past cases in Australia, foragers who mistook the deadly fungi for edible ones, whole families who fell ill after a single shared dish. It's not outside the realm of possibility. But the other details won't sit still. The separate meals for the children, the survival of the cook, the alleged history of unexplained illness in Simon, the fact that Erin threw away the dehydrator, not days later, but almost immediately, and that Simon, the intended fifth guest, declined the invitation at the last moment. All of it might be explainable, but taken together, it casts long shadows. And then there are the so-called historical incidents, now linked to Erin's attempted murder charges. Incidents not yet fully described to the public. The legal documents are sealed for now. The court will decide when and how those threads are brought into view. What we're left with, for now, is an eerie middle ground. Erin maintains her innocence. The court has not yet heard the full case. The evidence, while persuasive enough to lead to arrest, has not been tested under cross-examination, which means that for the people of Leongatha, and for those following around the world, the story still hums with uncertainty. And uncertainty is its own kind of fear. But not the fear of the horror film. This fear is gentler, quieter. It's the kind that settles in late at night, when the lights are low, and you think about the fact that the most dangerous things don't always knock on the door. Sometimes they come in smiling. Sometimes they are familiar. Sometimes they serve you lunch. It's the possibility that something terrible could happen without anyone noticing until it's too late. That something fatal could be disguised as comfort. That trust could be the very thing that does you in. The mystery of Erin Patterson, the so-called mushroom killer, remains unresolved for now. And in that unresolved space, we find ourselves turning over the same pieces again and again, hoping one day they will click into place. Until then, the fog remains. Beneath the gripping human drama of the Erin Patterson case lies a quieter, more universal warning. One that extends beyond the boundaries of Leongatha or any single meal. It's a conversation not about murder or motive, but about mushrooms, specifically the deadly ones. Death-cap mushrooms, Amanita phalloides, are among the most poisonous fungi in the world. Native to Europe, they've spread far beyond their original habitat, establishing a foothold in parts of North America and, crucially, in southeastern Australia. In Victoria, they are known to grow at the base of oak trees, particularly in the cooler months between late summer and early winter. They are not flashy or grotesque. They don't glow or radiate menace. To the untrained eye, they resemble harmless, even edible mushrooms. Smooth cap, pale yellow or olive hue, a white stalk, no obvious sign of danger. And that's the problem. The poison within, amatoxin, is deadly even in small quantities. It resists heat and cooking, meaning no amount of frying or baking will neutralize it. The toxin targets the liver and kidneys, working slowly and insidiously. Symptoms are often delayed by 6 to 12 hours, leading victims to believe they've escaped the worst. But once the damage begins, it accelerates rapidly. Without immediate medical attention, and often a liver transplant, survival becomes unlikely. Australia's Department of Health has long warned the public not to forage wild mushrooms unless they are trained, experienced mycologists. Yet every few years, stories surface. A family poisoned after collecting mushrooms on a walk. A tourist misidentifying a species they use back home. A curious child tasting something from the garden. It's a silent, lingering threat. And until the Patterson case, it was not widely known. Suddenly, though, the risks became national conversation. Newspapers published guides on identifying mushrooms. Experts appeared on morning talk shows. Do not pick wild mushrooms, they repeated, even if they look safe. The broader conversation extended beyond mycology. It prompted renewed discussions on food safety, especially within migrant communities unfamiliar with Australia's native flora. In many cultures, mushroom foraging is a cherished tradition, passed down through generations. But in a new environment, even familiar species can have deadly lookalikes. There was also renewed interest in the regulation of forage goods sold in markets. Were dried mushrooms truly available from certain grocers without clear labelling? Should there be stricter oversight? How do we trace the source when packaging is thrown away? For the medical community, the case brought renewed focus on toxin identification and emergency treatment protocols. There is no antidote for amatoxin poisoning, though experimental therapies and transplant strategies continue to evolve. Time, hydration, and early recognition remain the most important factors in survival. And for everyday people, the lesson was both simple and sobering. Some dangers don't look dangerous. Some meals don't end with dessert. And even in the safest seeming places, vigilance matters. The case of Erin Patterson may one day be resolved in court, with a verdict, a sentence, and a line drawn under the tragedy. But its ripple effects go further. It reminded a country of a hidden threat. It placed a humble ingredient under harsh scrutiny, and it asked all of us to pause just a moment before we eat what we cannot name. In the quiet town of Leongatha, the seasons have continued to change. Winter has faded into spring, then back again. The cafes have reopened. The school bells still ring. And yet, something in the town's rhythm remains unsettled, as though a note has been struck that never quite faded. 3 lives were lost over a single lunch. 1 man survived, bearing not only the physical scars of a liver transplant, but the silent weight of grief that no surgeon can remove. A woman now waits behind prison walls, her fate undecided, her name etched into the country's collective memory. A name spoken with confusion, sorrow, suspicion. And still, the fog of uncertainty lingers. Stories like this resist neat conclusions. They are not designed to be resolved in the final act like fiction. Real life is messier. It unfolds slowly, It leaves behind stray threads and unanswered questions. It dares us to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that some truths might never come fully into view. Perhaps one day the courtroom will bring clarity. Perhaps the prosecution will present irrefutable evidence, or perhaps the defense will plant reasonable doubt. Either way, the legal outcome may settle the matter of guilt, but not the emotional weight of what this story has meant. Because this was not just a tale of crime or consequence. It was a story about the fragility of trust. The trust we place in family. The trust we have in what we eat. The trust that the ordinary things in life, a kitchen, a lunch, a warm conversation, are safe. This case unraveled that trust in the softest, most intimate space, the dinner table. And maybe that's why it haunts us. There were no sirens, no screaming, no blood. Just a plate, just a meal, just a lingering illness that became a final breath. And so we sit with the fog. We return to the image of the Patterson and Wilkinson families, loved ones lost not to some dramatic evil, but to something far stranger. A meal turned fatal, a gathering turned ghostly, a mystery still unfolding. We think of the investigators working quietly behind the scenes, the medical teams who fought for lives already fading, the town trying to return to normal while something unseen still presses at its edges. And we think of Erin, neither convicted nor cleared, not a villain in the legal sense, not yet, not a victim perhaps, but certainly a person now forever altered. Whatever happens next, the shadow will remain. In the end, this isn't a story meant to startle you awake. It's one that asks you to slow down, to listen, to feel the stillness that follows grief, the weight of unanswered questions, the space between what we know and what we fear. Because in that space, in that soft, uncertain hush, is where the truth often lives. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us. Sleep gently, and may your table always bring comfort, never question. Good night.